right, good evening and welcome to the New Haven Museum. My name is Cynthia Riccio and I am the Director of Programs and Planning here at the museum. Tonight we are excited to bring you Conscience of the Congress, John Lewis and the Politics of Voting, with scholar and author David Greenberg. The 2024 election is the perfect time to discuss the career of civil rights hero and Congressman John Lewis, who helped bring about the Voting Rights Act and then fought for voting rights his whole career. Greenberg will base his presentation on his newly released biography, John Lewis, A Life, which is in the back if you would like to purchase it. Greenberg notes that Lewis's commitment to voting and voting rights is as timely as ever, adding, with anti-democratic forces on the rise, the vote is the way that we will rescue our democracy. With new details about Lewis's personal and professional relationships, Greenberg's presentation will offer an appreciation of the life and career and commitments of a man whose heroism during the civil rights movement helped to bring America a new birth of freedom. David Greenberg is a professor of history and of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University, Guggenheim Foundation, NEH, and Coleman Center Fellow. He is the author or editor of several books on American history and politics, including Nixon's Shadow, The History of an Image, and Republic of Spin, An Inside History of the American Presidency. Formerly acting editor of the New Republic and columnist for Slate, he now writes regularly for Politico, Liberties, and many other scholarly and popular publications. He holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and a BA from Yale University. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thanks to everyone at the museum and to all of you for coming. It is election season, and John Lewis, I think, and his life and what his life may have to say to us has probably never been more timely. Let's see, I haven't used this one before, so there we go. So just to say a word about this book I've just published, which is really just 2 weeks old, this baby book. So it really is a full biography. I start with John Lewis and his boyhood in rural Alabama, born to sharecroppers who scraped together enough money to buy their own plot of land, but still had a very hard life, picking peanuts and cotton and corn, a life John Lewis did not want for himself when he grew up. He also felt the sting of segregation, the brutality of the Jim Crow system, and from a very early age resolved that he was going to be one of the men and women who was going to fight it and bring about its end. He goes to college in Nashville at the American Baptist Theological Seminary and gets involved right away in what becomes the civil rights movement. The Nashville group of students, which is trained under social gospel ministers Kelly Miller Smith, James Lawson, and a divinity student at Vanderbilt, they're real either proteges or contemporaries of Martin Luther King. They believe in this sort of fusion of Gandhian civil disobedience and nonviolence with the Christian social gospel. And it leads to the sit-ins in Nashville. That's sort of the first slide there. Soon John Lewis is leading the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at 23, a national organization of students and recent graduates. As the head of the group, he meets with John F. Kennedy and the other great civil rights leaders in the Oval Office there. That's 1963. And then you see in the bottom panel the showdown at the bridge at Selma, where John Lewis led a march. It was supposed to be a march to Montgomery. It did not get past the bridge because the state troopers he's there confronting unleashed their fury on John Lewis and his fellow marchers, nearly killing him, sending him to the hospital, but also outraging the nation, mobilizing Congress, Lyndon Johnson, to finally pass a Voting Rights Act. But the book also goes on to tell the whole story of John Lewis's second act, which actually is much more than the second half of his life. His years doing voter registration, as you see in that first photograph. For 7 years, he led something called the Voter Education Project, which I'll talk about. He's in the Carter administration, and then goes into politics. And I write about his relationships with figures like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi. And ultimately, in his final years, he ascended to a kind of iconhood, got the Presidential Medal of Freedom, a degree from Yale. He's body surfing at the Colbert Show. He's there at the Oscars introducing the Best Picture winner called Green Book. And there, the final shot was his last visit to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 2020 when he was dying of pancreatic cancer, but still felt it important in that election year to get out, to implore people to preach the gospel of voting. So I divide the book up really into two books or two parts. The first is the part about protest, and the second is the book I call Politics. I also write a lot in the book about his family. I won't be talking about that tonight, but I'm happy to answer questions really about any part of his life or the book that maybe isn't directly covered in the talk about voting rights today. In particular, I think it's worth mentioning his wife, Lillian Miles Lewis. She's not well known. A lot of people would ask me, was he married? She kept a low profile. But she started dating him in 1968. John Lewis had just left the civil rights movement. He had kind of been kicked out of it. He left voluntarily, but SNCC had taken a turn away from liberal integrationism, away from Dr. King's vision of nonviolence, and toward what Stokely Carmichael, the new chairman, called Black Power. That's a term that means many different things to many different people. But suffice it to say, it went in a more radical direction that John Lewis felt he could not countenance. So 2 years after that, he goes to work for Robert F. Kennedy's presidential campaign in 1968. Lewis is a strong opponent of the Vietnam War, and even though he has admiration for LBJ, for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, he's realized Bobby Kennedy, or he comes to believe, is America's best hope at that time. He's with Robert Kennedy in Indianapolis, April 4th, the night that they learn Dr. King has been assassinated. And he's also with Bobby Kennedy in Los Angeles 2 months later when he himself is killed. And these assassinations just have a terrible, devastating effect on John Lewis. He's really trying to figure out his future. He's got no job, he's got no movement, he's not married at 28, which in those days, was old to be not married. And Lillian comes along, and John Lewis actually, I reveal in the book, was hospitalized for what seems to be depression. We called it exhaustion. Over that summer. Lillian comes each day. She brings him his mail, the newspaper. He's an avid reader, especially of the news. And very unromantically, he proposes to her from his hospital bed. One of his friends, a congressman from an adjacent district named Buddy Darden, a white Georgia congressman, said, "You cannot understand John Lewis's second act without understanding Lillian." That she was the one who gave this very self-effacing, retiring farm boy from Alabama the confidence to follow his ambitions, even fueled his ambitions, and said, "You can run for city council, you can run for Congress." She even thought he could be Speaker of the House or maybe President. Her ambitions for him were limitless. And she also put some of the steel in his spine that helped him ascend to this remarkable second career he had in politics. They adopted a son, John Miles, in 1976. You see him there, first as a young man, then as an adult. But today I want to really focus on the politics of voting. That's probably what John Lewis came to be best known for throughout his career, from the time of Selma, or even earlier, through his final days, and even, as I'll suggest, even after his final days. And indeed, one friend of mine who was doing leafleting and canvassing in Pennsylvania said there at the Harris headquarters were John Lewis bumper stickers, protect the right to vote, protect democracy. So he's still being looked to and invoked as a guardian of our democracy, as someone who might prod and stimulate us to protect it as well. The quote here, I think, is quite significant. The most powerful nonviolent tool we have in a democracy. John Lewis was always devoted to nonviolence in a way that I think very few, even of his many admirable colleagues in the movement, could muster. It really was a fundamental reason behind his break with SNCC. Some of his friends and colleagues believed in nonviolence as a tactic. You're sitting on the bar stool, the white racist thug comes up and starts beating you. You don't hit back. The cameras show what's happening. The newspapers tell what's happening. It mobilizes opinion. It's a tactic. But for John Lewis, as for King and James Lawson and the ministers he learned from, it was a deep philosophy and a conviction. He always said a philosophy and a way of life. And it was something he held to his whole life, his whole career, including in Congress. He would vote against every defense appropriations bill. There were a few times where he did support some military interventions, but always in the belief that this was necessary to save lives, such as the Kosovo operation in the 1990s. So he wasn't doctrinaire, but nonviolence was always at the center of his beliefs and something he held deep in his core. It's an interesting fact that when Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General, first proposed in 1961 the creation of the Voter Education Project, Lewis was against it. Lewis had just finished this very successful campaign in Nashville to desegregate the downtown five and dimes, their lunch counters, their dinettes. He had also just been really the prime mover in the Freedom Rides, which was a series of interstate bus travels of integrated pairs or teams of black and white volunteers who were trying to test and uphold the Supreme Court ruling that had ruled segregation in these bus terminals to be unconstitutional, but that went widely unenforced throughout the South. And John Lewis was actually away from the Freedom Rides just for a day or two when the most notorious violence of the whole trip happens. One of their buses is burned, a Molotov cocktail is thrown on, they're basically trying to be burned alive. They barely get off the bus, and then they're beaten with bats and sticks. He's away on that day. And James Farmer, who's in charge of the ride, decides to temporarily or perhaps permanently pause them. But Lewis, who's for the day back in Nashville with all his friends from the Nashville movement, they hear about this on the radio and they say, no, this must go on. So it's really John Lewis who gets his group together in Nashville to continue the Freedom Rides. So he's the one figure who's the link between what we call the first leg and the second leg. So again, a central figure in the sit-in movement, key figure in the Freedom Rides. And this is the time that Kennedy comes along with this plan. We'll get money from the foundations. There's a number of foundations that are giving a lot to civil rights cause. The Taconic Foundation, the Field Foundation. There are several. And his idea is we'll sort of funnel this money into voter registration drives. But people like John Lewis, who believe in what they call direct action, these confrontational techniques, think this is a ploy. All these students are making trouble. Kennedy's found it very difficult to deal with the Freedom Rides. They ultimately were supportive, but it was also kind of a headache for them. So Lewis and a lot of the students think this is just to get us into some safe activity of just trying to get people to vote. But in time, he comes to see that direct action and voter registration are actually interlinked. That you need direct action to force the cause of voting reform, and you need to get some voting reform if blacks are ever going to have any real power in the South. And so they go hand in hand, and you can't just say, I favor one or the other. And in fact, in 1963, when he, as chairman of SNCC, is giving his speech at the famous March on Washington, he makes a point of talking about voting rights, because the voting rights was not included in the 1963 Kennedy bill, which becomes the 1964 Civil Rights Act, where there's very minimal provisions for voting. So he's calling their attention to, all the other speakers are saying, let's pass the bill. Lewis decides after some negotiation, all right, well, let's pass it, but let's voice our reservations. And he points out that it doesn't really do much to protect the vote for those who don't have, what is deemed a sufficient education. And he's been reading about the new elections in the newly liberated, what had been northern Rhodesia, and it's now Zimbabwe. And he sees in the paper someone holding a sign, one man, one vote. That's kind of the rallying cry of this African liberation movement. And he picks it up here. I'd always associated with the Supreme Court ruling about districting, but Lewis's views came first. And so he's calling for legislation to protect sharecroppers from being punished and all kinds of other intimidation and retaliation that happened when people simply tried to assert their constitutional right to vote. And then, of course, Selma. Selma really becomes the place for the big voting rights campaign. John Lewis is still chairman of SNCC, and at this time SNCC is feuding pretty badly with Martin Luther King and his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But John Lewis, who has always idolized King, he's personally close to King, he'll never publicly say a bad word about Dr. King. And there's a Sunday march scheduled, and most of the SNCC people decide they don't want to go. But Lewis kind of convinced them to let him and anyone else who wants, and there were some others who did, to go not representing SNCC formally, but just representing themselves. So he's leading the march with Hosea Williams from SCLC. Dr. King doesn't show up, which further annoys the SNCC people. It turns out there were a number of reasons having to do with a court injunction, also threats of violence, threats on his life. And King, and Lewis, as you see in these really amazing photographs, stops as he confronts the troopers, and before they can even turn around, they just have knelt down to say a prayer, the troopers charge them, and with billy clubs and horses start wailing on John Lewis and Hosea Williams and all the assembled older women. They're indiscriminate. It's a bloodbath. Some of this is filmed. It's on the news that night. ABC interrupts the movie of the week, which it was noted with irony was Judgment at Nuremberg, to show what was going on in the American South. And although Lyndon Johnson favored a voting rights bill, he was getting a lot of political pressure. Not yet. We're still kind of massaging our way through this last bill, you moved mountains to get passed in 1964. But sure enough, after Bloody Sunday, Lyndon Johnson goes on national television, not only calls for a voting rights bill, but uses in his speech the phrase, "We shall overcome," the song that had become the anthem, really first with John Lewis's national movement and then of the movement more generally. And anyway, this really is, I think, the moment that seals John Lewis's association with voting rights as his principal cause. Then, for 7 years, it's a little-known chapter of his life. He's put in charge of something called the Voter Education Project. As I mentioned, this was the group that kind of a nonprofit that the Justice Department had helped midwife earlier. But its mission now, after the 65 Voting Rights Act, is even more urgent, because there are millions of blacks around the South who now can legally avail themselves of this right to vote but for one reason or another aren't doing so. Some of that Lewis came to see was psychological, a kind of learned passivity or inertia. He actually wrote a law review article, it was interesting, with Archie Allen, one of his close aides, where he says the habits instilled by Jim Crow would, quote, continue to dominate the psyche of an oppressed people even after the barriers to full participation had been removed. So you'll see in John Lewis's life both a push for institutional reform to make voting easier, but also an emphasis on individual initiative. Sometimes I think in our political debates we see those as, a binary. He thought it was both and. Yeah, and it was not only kind of personal reluctance. He talked and he would testify before Congress about harassment, about intimidation, people who controlled the jobs, the Social Security checks, the mortgages of black people throughout the South might send, subtle or not so subtle messages about you don't need to really go register. He talked about sneaky practices, how in black districts the registrars would open late, close early, take long lunches. Improper polling places, a polling place would be somebody's front porch with a Doberman pinscher, tied up just a few yards away. So there were a lot of reasons why black voter turnout lagged in the 60s and 70s. But throughout those 7 years, something like 3.5 million blacks across the South registered for the first time. And in 1976, when Jimmy Carter is elected, it's actually very different from the electoral map of a Democrat today or in recent times. Carter wins most of the South, including the Deep South. And it's on the strength, yes, of some white moderate votes, but also a lot of black votes who had never turned out in those numbers before. And at the Voter Education Project, they had a slogan, the hands that pick the cotton now pick our elected officials. And in 76, John Lewis said, the hands that pick the cotton now pick our president. Then I'll sort of fast forward a little bit through his Carter and city council years and come to his time in Congress. He really was the figure without whom action on voting rights could not progress. Partly it was strategic. People knew, if you want to get a voting rights bill or a voting rights renewal passed, you want John Lewis in your corner. And that first slide, you see him on the House of the floor holding up these blow-up images of Selma. And it was 2006. He had been working quite, amicably across the aisle with a Wisconsin congressman named Jim Sensenbrenner, a fairly conservative guy, but one who believed in the Voting Rights Act, that it needed to be renewed. And just when they're on the verge of getting it passed, a group of Southern white congressmen, including some of Lewis's own members of the Georgia delegation, start throwing up all these roadblocks. And one of them, a man named Lynn Westmoreland, starts quoting back words of John Lewis to him. There had been one case in which John Lewis, for complicated reasons, had actually been arguing for a certain redistricting plan that would diminish black representation. And in that, he's saying that we've begun, as he often said, to lay down the burden of race. So this guy, Westmoreland, takes these words sort of out of context and is now using them as an argument not to renew the Voting Rights Act in 2006. Lewis gets quite indignant. He goes back to his office, or maybe his aides bring it to the floor. They had these blow-ups at the ready. He was very good at instrumentally using his history and his heroism for a political advantage. And he basically sort of makes Lynn Westmoreland quiet for the rest of the congressional session. Lewis also, it was actually the year before, 2005, testifies against the confirmation of John G. Roberts when George Bush nominates him as Chief Justice of the United States. And You may remember Roberts was kind of a popular choice. He seemed a moderate, he had an impeccable resume, he certainly didn't seem like a fire-breathing reactionary, and a lot of Democrats were sort of prepared to support him on the reasoning, well, it's a Republican president, it's his pick. But Lewis had read John Lewis's memos as a Justice Department official in the Reagan administration, and he warned, John Roberts is going to gut the Voting Rights Act. I've seen these memos, and they were publicized, they were in newspapers, of what, his arguments about why the Voting Rights Act is no longer needed. They were closer to Lynn Westmoreland's arguments than they were to John Lewis's. And sure enough, 7 years later, in the Shelby County decision, the justices of a conservative majority basically nullifies a key provision of the Voting Rights Act that eliminates what they call pre-clearance. It means that if you want to change your rules, your districts, if you want to make changes to how people in your state can vote, you got to clear it with the Justice Department or the courts first, because these are districts with a long history of racial discrimination in voting, and we're not quite ready to say you're on your own. But of course, with Shelby County, they are now free to do that. Sometimes it gets challenged ex post facto, but that's very different from having to get prior authorization. And I think it's all relevant as we think about voter turnout, and especially black turnout. Maybe a little confusing, the white line or gray line is black turnout, and the black line is white turnout. But you'll see that black turnout has historically lagged white turnout, often considerably. It went up in 2008 and 2012. You probably can think of what made those two elections distinctive. And indeed, a lot of people attribute that to Barack Obama's presence as the Democratic presidential nominee. However, recently the Brennan Center, which studies voting rights and voting legislation, found that there's another possible explanation. That Shelby County in 2013 seems to have had a negative effect, exacerbating the racial turnout gap precisely in those districts that were no longer covered by the Voting Rights Act, by the pre-clearance requirement. In other words, it became easier to impose certain restrictions on voting, and they do seem to have had some dampening effect on turnout, black turnout in particular. So again, there are both personal reasons, personal motivation becomes an issue, but also institutional reform, legislative reform becomes necessary. And indeed, in 2020, the bill to basically assert congressional priority over Supreme Court to kind of clarify that Congress does indeed intend to have preclearance, that and other voting reforms are folded into what gets called the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And 2020, of course, is the year that John Lewis is now terminally ill. At the end of 2019, he's diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It's a shock to him. It's a shock to his friends, family, everyone in Congress. And then, of course, we have the pandemic. And so he's at home. He has his chief of staff and a few close aides are taking care of him. He's going to his medical appointments, comes into Congress once or twice and is much celebrated and beloved. And then, we have this remarkable confluence of major events. The pandemic, this very important presidential election. I mean, it was no secret that John Lewis had come to see Donald Trump as a real menace to democracy, as someone who, as early as 2016, before he was elected, was saying he would not accept the election results if he didn't win. I mean, he said in the fall of 16, so 16, 20, 24, it's a pretty consistent position that Trump has taken. So Lewis really did regard Trump as an enemy of democracy, or at least someone who had no regard for democracy. So you have the Trump election, you have the pandemic, and then, of course, you have the killing of George Floyd by a police officer, which prompts, as we all know, a whole wave of protests that summer. John Lewis dies in July of 2020. But the most remarkable thing happens. If anything, it seems that his name is more in the news and in the headlines in the subsequent weeks and months. If you were getting text message reminders from the DNC or any kind of Democratic campaign group, they would often be quoting John Lewis, have his picture, have reminders from John Lewis, like that quote I showed earlier about how important the vote was. At the convention that summer, I counted 20 different speakers invoked John Lewis's name, from Biden and Kamala Harris to Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, up and down. They understood that turnout was going to be important to defeating Trump, that black turnout in particular would be important, and that John Lewis was the one who could deliver that message, even though he had passed from this earth. And sure enough, in November, Clayton County, which is part of John Lewis's district, delivers the trove of ballots that gives Joe Biden the victory in Georgia, a state that no Democrat since Bill Clinton had won. And that, along with Pennsylvania, of course, gives Biden the presidency. Now, Georgia, you may recall, in its Senate race, has this funny runoff business. So it's not settled on the November election day. They have a runoff that is held in early January. And on January 5th, in another tribute to John Lewis's power and legacy, two new candidates for Senate, John Ossoff, who had been John Lewis's intern and friend, and Raphael Warnock, who had been his pastor at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, who really ran together, trying to bring back that Black-Jewish alliance, interracial alliance, hand in hand on similar causes, emphasizing the importance of voting. They both are ushered to victory by Georgia voters. It was projected as a close race, but I think we can call it an upset. So there we have the Atlanta AJC cartoonist Mike Lukovich showing John Lewis in heaven. There's a famous video, maybe some of you have seen it, of John Lewis dancing to Pharrell Williams' "Happy." It was a song he loved, so he's happy. And then, of course, the very next day, we have these paramilitaries of Donald Trump's MAGA movement, storming and overrunning the Capitol as senators and members of Congress are trying to, certify the presidential election in really the closest scare that our democracy has had since the Civil War. And January 5th, January 6th really showed that America was at a crossroads when it came to democracy. For me, at least, it's quite easy to imagine a path where the better angels of our nature prevail and we get out the vote and the defenders of democracy kind of return to power and try to bring us back to a place of resolving our differences, not through violence, but through nonviolence, through debate, through moral example. Or we have another path that upholds violence as the answer when an election doesn't go your way. That looks at democracy cynically as simply something to use so long as it suits your needs. And I think that's it. I think the choice that we saw in 2020 is somewhat shockingly back with us today in almost identical form. People sometimes ask me with book talks, what would John Lewis say? And I don't like to channel or speak for someone else, especially someone who's dead. But I do think we know that John Lewis would say things like he always said, vote like you've never voted before. never quite know what that means exactly. He wrote once, but he would talk about keeping the faith, keep your eyes on the prize, and the idea that the vote is a sacred, nonviolent, the most important sacred nonviolent tool that we have in democracy. So let me stop there. Thank you, and look forward to your comments and questions. In the back, right?
Yeah. So you had said, I think it was Shelby County or something, there was that decision that they overturned this part of the Voting Rights Act, and you described this as part of the reason that the black turnout was lower in subsequent elections. Can you describe what the actual tactics that you think have been reinstated or instated after that decision are, and do we see them? Where are we seeing them in the country? You're going to vote next week or 2 weeks?
Yeah, I mean, we see them in a lot of states. Georgia has imposed some pretty severe restrictions.
So tell me what they are.
North Carolina, yeah, but also some northern states, I think Wisconsin. They range from things like fewer polling places, right? I mean, some are very simple, like those sneaky practices. Fewer polling places. Fewer places, now that mail-in absentee is becoming common, fewer drop boxes where you can deliver them. Rules, one kind of infamous one in Georgia, which even became like a Curb Your Enthusiasm episode. You can't give someone food or water when they're standing in line to vote. And my New York polling place, there's never more than a 2-minute line. But in some places you have hours-long lines, and you're going to criminalize giving someone a drink. I think those laws were originally designed to prevent corruption, but and then there are matters of redistricting. So if you're going to gerrymander your state, it used to be you had to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department that this was a valid way to redo your district. No more. So it can be challenged after the fact. I'm trying to think what else. There's a variety of other identification laws are a big issue. Some places will, I think Texas, allows identification law, requires you to have an identification, and you can have a gun license as ID, but not a student ID. So some of the laws are kind of tailored to affect certain constituencies more than others. So there's really a whole range of these things, and I think to get into the politics of it, the Democrats may have made a mistake in making this John Lewis bill too much of an omnibus bill that includes so many reforms that it maybe makes it hard for more moderate conservatives to get on board. I sort of think they should at some point try for a grand bargain where you say, we make Election Day a national holiday, you have a month of early voting everywhere, but then you also allow the conservatives to say you need an ID to vote, which actually like 70% of Americans support. You can argue, and I think maybe it is unfair because poorer populations will have a harder time, but that could probably be overcome. Anyway, the fight for voting reform, I think it hasn't gotten as much attention as it should, but Trump and Harris are on diametrically opposed positions, so it's an important one this season.
Thank you.
When you say ID, you mean photo ID?
Photo ID.
Government issued photo ID.
Right, exactly. Look, probably most of you carry some kind of photo ID, and a lot of people hear that suggestion. They say, "Oh, what's the big deal?" But for many people in other populations, whether elderly, poor, it can be an obstacle, and because it falls on certain people hardest, it's unfair to certain groups and discriminatory. So, it's not done in pure innocence. Yes. Good.
So you mentioned the discussion of what the one man, one vote,
right?
Part of Lewis's speech. That was the March on Washington speech. Yeah?
Right.
So you are I'm thinking of being moved towards compromise and being moved to
Right.
accept others. In your book, you do a fascinating presentation of Lewis's speech on the March on Washington, in which he comes in with a plan, and some of it is really quite challenging. All sorts of hands mess around,
Right.
including the Burt Marshall, who used to teach here at our law school, and was viewed as an icon of the civil rights movement. So he had messes and softens. Could you talk about what that was like for Lewis?
Yeah.
To have his vision messed with at the March on Washington with the largest audience he would maybe ever have.
Right, right. You know, it's a wonderful story, and I think one that's revealing both about the conflicts and fissures in the movement, you know, which I think sometimes in popular culture, it gets romanticized as it was one big happy family. And I mean, SNCC did call themselves a band of brothers, a circle of trust, and prided themselves on their personal closeness. But there were also very serious differences, ideological, tactical, and otherwise. It also, I think, says a lot about John Lewis. Basically, Lewis is a brand new chairman of SNCC. The previous chairman, a guy named Chuck McDew, has sort of resigned prematurely. And Lewis is fresh off a big victory in Nashville in 1963. Also a little-known story that I think I tell for the first time fully in the book. So he comes into this office, again, not too sure of himself. He's certainly never spoken to 250,000 people. He's never led a major organization like this. And SNCC has a lot of competing tendencies within it. And he feels he's very self-effacing. His job is to, yes, speak for himself, but also to speak for his organization. So he writes a draft, a friend helps him revise it, everybody in the SNCC office is giving input. When the March on Washington is first conceived, many months earlier, even in late '62, by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, two other great giants of the movement, there's no civil rights bill on the table, right? So it's partly designed to push things forward. And in fact, they see it as a march initially for jobs. Then when King gets involved, it's jobs and freedom. So it's sort of like the Northern, Randolph and Rustin is jobs, King is freedom, but it becomes all these things. And John F. Kennedy, kind of looking to get out in front of things, 1963 is an amazing year. You have the Birmingham campaign, you have George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama. All of this prods the Kennedys to say the time is now here for us to finally introduce this bill. So by the time Lewis is called on to give the speech, the terms have shifted. And instead of this being a rally to demand action from the Kennedy administration, it's a rally to the Kennedys very shrewd to say, hey, support the Kennedys, support the Kennedy bill. And Lewis and SNCC don't want to take that. As I said, they see these things that are missing. There's no good voting rights protections. There's other problems with the bill. And Lewis is quite determined to call attention to its flaws and even to give some pretty stinging, caustic commentary about the Democratic Party, pointing out that, well, the Republicans have Jacob Javits, a liberal, but also they're the party of Goldwater. And, you know, the Democrats may be the party, I forget if it's Humphrey or whatever noble civil rights supporter he cites, but they're also the party of James Eastland. So it's not a pro-Democrat speech either. Well, the day before, one of Lewis's colleagues at SNCC sees some other speeches out on a table. So other people are putting out advanced drafts. We should do that with John's speech, get some publicity. It gets picked up by an aide to the Archbishop of Washington who's set to give the benediction. He reads the speech, has a whole welter of criticisms, things he wants changed. It makes its way to the Justice Department, Burke Marshall, Kennedy's. Everybody's got things they want to dial down. Some of it wasn't even John Lewis's language. At one point, a colleague of his, really a colleague of Bayard Rustin's, a white socialist activist named Tom Kahn, had put in a line, "We're going to march to the South the way Sherman did," which is not a sentiment John Lewis would ever support. So he then adds at the end of the sentence, non-violently, which of course renders it just completely meaningless. Anyway, King sees that line, and he says very astutely, he says, John, that doesn't sound like you. That line comes out. And there's this very intense negotiation that's going on right there, right in the shadow of Daniel Chester French's colossal Lincoln statue. They're there in that, up on the memorial itself, huddled in the back. Somebody's got like a little Underwood typewriter, and they're sort of making changes on the script and then typing up new drafts. Lewis, who is never that confident in his public speaking, had practiced the previous version like 100 times the previous weekend. So he's hovering over and saying, don't change too much, don't change too much. But what I think was kind of amazing is, in the end, if you watch the speech, and you can find it on YouTube, it's still quite a militant, defiant speech. He managed both to sort of placate King and Randolph and all the others, to give them just enough to say instead of saying we oppose the Kennedy bill, saying we support it with reservations. There were a few changes of some substance and some were linguistic tweaks. And yet he still manages to say what he wants to say. And I think it's an example, not of John Lewis selling out, but of the early signs of his political sense, what made him an effective congressman too. That he knew he couldn't go too hard because it would cast a pall on what was otherwise sort of shaping up as this amazingly triumphant day. But he also knew it would be wrong to sort of mute those criticisms entirely. And I think he, along with his SNCC colleagues, found this middle path very much on the fly that ended up leaving a very memorable speech. Yes?
Did you spend time with him? Did you know him?
I spent only a little bit of time with him, but I feel I know him. I mean, I studied him. Right, I studied him every day for 5 years, reading his writings, watching him on video, listening to his voice, interviewing his friends, colleagues, family. I mean, I first met with him. He had just done the coin toss at the Super Bowl, and then the next day was headed to LA for the Oscars. So it was kind of peak John Lewis, 2019. Super Bowl, me, Oscars. And then that first year, I did not really try to interview him because I had just background reading to do, archival work to do. And then that December was when he had his cancer discovered. So during the pandemic, we did some telephone interviews. I couldn't go visit him. And those were helpful. But honestly, some of the things I found in the archives, so this guy I mentioned who did the law review article with him, Archie Allen. Archie amazingly started a John Lewis biography in 1968. Never wrote it. And I found this guy who was involved in the civil rights movement, then in Atlanta, but at a certain point in his life, moved to Ojai, California to become a chiropractor. And there he had in his house this huge collection of John Lewis materials, including his birth certificate, his high school report cards, his college acceptance letter, which said, we hope it is part of God's plan that you come and study with us, which I was very happy when I got an acceptance letter from Yale, but it didn't say that. Anyway, so I finally, after a couple of years, got Archie to ship me. He calls me up from the post office saying, can I have your credit card? I have 3 banker's boxes here I'm ready to ship at the post office. I said, hold on, I'll get the card. And in that, there was also a series of oral history interviews Archie had done with John Lewis over 10 years, stretching to nearly 300 pages, that gave in far greater detail so much of his life than I ever could have hoped to extract from, an 80-year-old man. So, it was really a work of archival history, and then also, since I wear both hats, a work of journalism, and I ended up interviewing something like 275 people, and just getting that, rich, textured stories from them. So I feel I know John Lewis, even though I really wish I could have gotten to know him in person even better.
Hi, I happen to be an archivist, so I was really interested in hearing a little bit about your research process, like everything you just said, and I'm just curious, would you be able to maybe go into a little more detail about kind of like what your biggest challenges were when researching, or perhaps like what were the biggest things that made it easier, or perhaps like what were some of the biggest kind of sources of authority that you drew from your research?
Yeah, there's a lot of sides of that question I could take up. Probably some of the best sources of material were the papers of colleagues of his that have been, donated to universities or other institutions. Julian Bond's papers, James Foreman's papers. There's even a small Lillian Miles Lewis collection at the Woodruff Library in Atlanta, which I don't think anyone had ever been in before. Regrettably, his staff did not make the congressional papers available to me. I think they're still in closets. They haven't been processed. I don't think they've even chosen, an institution to give them to. So that's why I relied much more, and both on press accounts and that sort of thing, and interviews. And sometimes it was always nice if one of his staff members, like from the 90s or 2000s, said, "Oh, why don't you come over to my place and we'll interview there?" Because then there sometimes comes the moment, let me go in the back and see what I have. And sometimes, there's paper there. And as you know, as an archivist, as historians know, trust the document over the memory. Sometimes you have to go with the memory. But, just to give one little example, I talked about that famous speech Lyndon Johnson gave in March of '65 where he says, "We shall overcome." So in Selma, like in John Lewis's memoir, he writes about being with Dr. King and seeing a tear roll down his cheek. Well, I found much earlier newspaper accounts where John Lewis says to the reporter, "I heard that Dr. King cried that night. I heard." He places himself elsewhere. He was in Selma, but he wasn't at the same house as Dr. King. But I think in telling this story many times, he kind of created a visual memory of himself seeing King cry. And then he began telling the story that way. So I felt it was really a pleasure to kind of use both of my skill sets as a historian and journalist, and sometimes kind of triangulate them in order to try to get at least as close as possible to what seemed like the most truthful, accurate account. Yes?
I haven't yet read your book, but I did read the New York Times review.
Yeah.
And it was a great review, by the way.
Yes, I was pleased.
But
Thank you.
the story about John Lewis and Julian Bond and the breakup
Yeah.
of their friendship
Yeah.
was fascinating to me. I don't know if people here have heard it, but you don't have those images of that happening. Maybe
Right.
you could
Yeah,
speak to
no,
it.
it's also an amazing story, and I managed to fit into one, I think, exciting chapter 19. To try to tell it briefly, John Lewis has been serving on the Atlanta City Council when White Fowler, the white representative from Atlanta's 5th District, decides to run for Senate. And Lewis, who had run once before against Fowler in 1977, lost but finished a creditable second. Lewis thinks he's going to give it another go. But so does his best friend, Julian Bond. Now, when I say they were best friends, Julian Bond, who came from a background very different from Lewis's. His father was a celebrated educator, a college president. As a boy, he met Albert Einstein and Paul Robeson when they came to his home. So he came from upper middle class, or you might even say elite, black Atlanta society. And so Julian and John became good friends, and it was Julian who would teach John Lewis, how to order in a restaurant, or like what's a mixed drink, and these basic things that John Lewis was so grateful to kind of have some orientation in this big new world he was suddenly a part of. And when they marry, they and their wives become close as couples. They vacation together. Julian's son told me about sitting on Lillian's knee as they flew to Disney World, and all kinds of these wonderful memories. But by '86, they had become a little bit estranged. And Julian also felt he had been in the Georgia First Legislature and then State Senate for about 20 years by now, and he kind of realized it was time either to move up or move out. At first, it seems like it's going to be a rout for Bond, because even though today we know John Lewis as this colossal figure, at the time, he was this sort of rumpled, quiet guy, whose heroism was known, but he was a city councilman, and Julian Bond, he was in movies, he was hosting SNL, incredibly handsome man, kind of witty and articulate, and kind of all of elite Atlanta, white and black, kind of lines up behind him. But Lewis, well, for one thing, he works harder. He's out there, every day from dawn till dusk. Even, at night after sundown, he'll go into 24/7 convenience stores and just shake hands with people in the aisles. He's just tireless. And there's also the little issue, which John Lewis knows about full well. And I saw the FBI files and interviewed the police officer who took some of the reports. Bond had a pretty serious cocaine problem, which was an open secret in parts of Atlanta, but certainly not known to all voters. And in the multi-candidate stage of the race, remember we're talking about the runoffs. So at first there's all these different candidates vying for the seat, for the Democratic nomination. And they go to, a vote where it'll be narrowed down to 2. And during that multi-candidate stage, a woman named Mildred Glover, who's kind of a gadfly, kind of referencing, without singling Bond out by name, says, all of us on this stage should take a drug test. I mean, this is the summer of Just Say No. Ronald Reagan is having his whole cabinet take drug tests and announce the results publicly. Lenny Bias at the University of Maryland, the Celtics top draft pick, dies the next day of a drug overdose. Voters list drugs as their number one issue. So it's not a frivolous issue. Today we might, and at the time there were many people who saw this as, an intrusion on civil liberties. So then Lewis ekes his way into a runoff. It's something like 47% for Bond and 34% for Lewis. So he's pretty far behind. But he forces the runoff because you got to clear 50% to avoid the runoff. And Bond, thinking he can finish off John Lewis, challenges him to a series of 4 televised debates. Because here's Julian Bond, who's so gifted as an orator, and has a command of policy and just a facility with the policy details that John Lewis just struggles to put across. Well, during these debates, 2 things happen. First, Bond starts coming off to a lot of voters as someone who feels he's entitled to this seat, as someone maybe who's too slick and too charismatic, and is he really going to work hard in this job as my elected United States representative? John Lewis, say what you will, he's going to be there plugging away for you. It's just he has this authenticity that comes through, even though he may not, be as silver-tongued as Julian. But the other thing is, John Lewis's campaign managers are telling him, you got to bring up the drug test. And the first debate goes by, and one of them told me we were like Angelo Dundee and Customato, the boxing coaches in the corners. You got to use it, like urging him to drop it in. He lets the first debate come and go without. But in the second debate, Bond comes at Lewis with some cheap attack. Basically, he says he's taken a donation from a lobbyist, and the lobbyist was just a longtime friend of John Lewis's who he'd worked with politically for years. And Lewis gets his dander up because he's nothing if not an ethical man, and to have his ethics questioned, on television really irritates him. And so then he says, he picks up from Mildred Glover, we should take the drug test. This becomes kind of a big issue the next 2 weeks. And sure enough, on election night, and if you read the chapter 19, like the account I got from the campaign managers, the people in the room, it's just so beautiful, like the way they tell the story of, at first it looks like Lewis is going to lose, but then at the end of the night, a whole tranche of votes comes in from Buckhead, which is sort of upper Atlanta, and wealthier and whiter. And the guy, his name's Love Collins, after telling Lewis, I think you're going to lose, and Lewis saying, oh, that's a shame, I'm feeling bad, he hears a cheer go up. He goes out into the room where they're watching TV, and he comes back, and he just sort of extends his hand, says, congratulations, Mr. Congressman. And it's a moment of wonderful triumph. I mean, John Lewis did have regret. He did say later in life that he regretted using it, and if he had to do it over again, he might not. Probably wouldn't not. I forget his exact words. But he and Julian made some efforts to patch things up, but it never went back to the friendship that they had once had, and that is a sort of tragic piece of the story. Anyway, that's chapter 19. Yes?
I just 2 days ago read your review in the New Yorker, and they also thought you did a wonderful job.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, listen to these people at the Times in New York. You know what they're talking about. Yeah, well, no, it's been nice to have this book get a good reception, and it will seem incredibly petty for me to criticize these two, extremely generous and also just thoughtful reviews. But there were a couple of notes. That was a similar note in each review, talking about John Lewis's political career. Brent Staples, who reviewed it for the New York Times, said Lewis became something of an apparatchik for the Democratic Party. And Kalefa Sana at the New Yorker, I forget the language, but somewhere a little kind of note of disdain for, his choice to become a politician and behave like a politician, whether that means going negative against his friend or helping Clinton get a bill to the floor, even though Lewis didn't like the bill because he knew that the alternative would be a worse bill. This was the famous 1994 crime bill. So there were a lot of ways in which Lewis made political decisions that I think a couple of these reviews seem to, not think well of. Myself, I believe in politics as a legitimate profession and pursuit. It doesn't inherently have the same codes that we may follow in other parts of our life. It's the nature of politics that you have to be pragmatic, you have to compromise, you have to be self-promoting, you have to do a lot of things that John Lewis learned to do. And I see his ability to become a success in politics in Washington after having been such a success in the world of protest, not as a come down or a failure, but actually as an even greater tribute that he found two related but sort of distinct callings in his life and managed to move history in both of them. Any other comments or questions? All right, well, thank you all very much. We have books if I'd be happy to sign. And I thank you all for coming out tonight.